Great. Okay, so we have gone through two successive discussions of aspects of study planning previously, and I wanted to hit on several additional aspects, particularly those having to do with participant incentives, some special characteristics of different populations that with which we have used tools in the IEPI project and Ethica Health especially, and then talk a little bit about the choice of data backhaul, Wi-Fi, smartphone use over cell networks as contrapositions. And then I'd also like to talk some about the issue of phone ownership. Who owns the phones? And welcome Mohammed and Kevin to jump in as they see fit, because they have a lot of wisdom to bring to bear. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about participant incentives. By incentives here, I'm speaking about rewards, monetary or non-monetary, that participants may receive in appreciation for, or otherwise in return for being part of your study. So when we go and recruit several dozen individuals to take part in a study of mosquito exposure, or individuals within a long-term care facility to monitor their movements, there's a certain amount of burden that they may undergo, even just downloading the app, answering questions on it, going through the rigmarole of entering a baseline entry survey. And often there's a desire on the part of those running the study to give some token of appreciation for that. But more than that, there's also a sense of, well, we need to do something to, in return for the burden, or people won't want to participate. And there's a number of issues that I'd like to discuss there, and these span the gamut from sort of non-monetary elements to monetary. This is one of my worst organized slides, but non-monetary incentives come in a variety of forms. Participant access to their own data is one of them that can be attractive for certain types of information that's gathered. To provide, as Kevin is fond of saying, and I've grown fond of it, this idea of the data being collected and presented to participants as providing more perfect mirror for their own activities, kind of more helping them understand at a large scale the patterns of behavior that otherwise might be lost on a day-to-day level. Perhaps it's the factors that trigger stress in an infant. The particular context in which an infant exhibits signs of distress, and physiologically that's recorded by a smartwatch through the form of EDA and the electrodermal activity and the heart rate variability. Or perhaps it's situations in which a person is eating more healthily or less healthily, or in which they're more sedentary or not. Sometimes it's easy to miss the forest for the trees, and if we summarize data at a more high level, or at least join it, put it all in one place so that they can browse it, there may be some insight secured. Now, this is an embryonic area, Mohammed will readily tell you, within Ethica Health, providing readily accessible and understandable and value-delivering interfaces of participants to their own data. But it's one that Ethica Health right now supports by providing studies with the option of letting participants log in to see their data or not. Some studies opt out, as Mohammed noted, because of possible influence on persons' behaviors, and they want to maintain a more strict protocol where we try to minimize the study impact on behaviors. In other cases, it's seen as part of the study value is delivering some potential for positive behavior change. Other forms of non-monetary incentives might include things such as use of a nice smartphone, a nice new smartphone, a smartphone that has features on it that they wouldn't otherwise be able to afford, and perhaps permanent ownership of that smartphone following the study. So they use it for the duration of the study and then they can keep it. That's another form of non-monetary incentive. In other cases, there may be community-based sharing of data that goes on, and some of the incentive is to be able to see what other people have posted and to be able to be posting myself types of information. In other cases, we operate studies with monetary incentives, incentives that provide a certain amount of money per month. And we've run studies where that amount of money per month ranges up as high as, I think, 70 Canadian dollars per month. And I think maybe more in some of the ground truth studies, which ask for really intensive recording of things like posture, status, indoor, outdoor, vehicular, and with respect to cigarette use in separate studies. I think we had even higher levels of compensation that we provided because of the intensive nature of the work. Now, when we do operate studies with monetary incentives, we particularly have made use of incentives, not exclusively by any means, but in a number of studies where the amount of incentive provided is throttled by, or is gated by, is prorated by, is a better way to put it, their participation. So if that person, for example, is providing very little information in response to the questionnaires which pop up, if most of them they're canceling or letting them expire, we might actually deliver less in the way of these compensation than if they are a fulsome participant. And one has to be very careful about this because of the potential for altering behavior. We certainly do not, to make the worst use case, we certainly do not want to provide an individual with greater incentives the more cases, instances of smoking they report, the greater their incentive package is. That would be adverse. It would potentially alter their behavior in an adverse direction. Instead, we might reward them based on the consistency of their results between what they report proactively and what they report in response to questionnaires. Now, for lower SES individuals particularly, but also for some mid socioeconomic status individuals, we will sometimes also be able to provide considerable benefits by provision of good smartphones, but also smartphone data plans, which they might not otherwise be able to afford or afford readily. So there's some linkage certainly with the population at issue. We have been involved in one notable study where the incentives came in the form of merely a desire to contribute to knowledge about health in their province. And we have found challenges in recruitment for that study that have been notable, so with no incentives at all. And in other cases, going further back, I remember running some studies with Kevin back in the day, which involved raffles instead of outright incentives. So it'd be a smaller number of participants, and they could win. I think it was an iPod, if I'm not mistaken, for the first time we ran the study, with which Mohammed enjoyed a measure of acquaintance. Actually, Mohammed ran it day to day. He was also involved in helping to ensure the police that a beacon that was present was not a bomb, which was a point of some concern. You remember that incident?
Very, very clearly.
Yes, indeed.
Hard to forget.
Yes, dealing with campus security. In any case, we have used a variety of designs. The Raffles design was fairly successful. I'm trying to remember, Kevin, did we back then run any studies within the department that involved no incentives at all, no Raffles, et cetera? No. Every one has involved some incentives, yeah. Any comments, Kevin, you want to make, or Mohammed, on this issue of incentives put broadly? I'm gonna talk about the low SES sort of linkage there. But any comments, Mohammed? You've acquired a lot of wisdom about this through many studies.
One alternative that I think can be helpful is to assign that to the tasks that they are doing. And assign the incentive to the tasks that they are doing, whether it's filling surveys or reporting something. And we don't necessarily have to feed back data to them, but we can just simply tell them how compliant they have been.
Yep.
And based on that, we can say, so far, for example, you have accumulated 90% or 80% of the incentives they have promised.
Right.
And I think that we have not tried this approach, but I think it can really help with the compliance.
And potentially, if you compared that against others?
Maybe, but if just simply saying that you have to, for example, be at 80% or higher in order to receive the whole incentive, then they have a way to check it. So if they are 50%, they're not surprised that, or maybe they put a bit more effort to comply.
Go back and fill out all the questionnaires.
Yeah.
So that's, you can do that. You can feed that back at the end of the month.
We don't have it implemented right now, but that's an easy thing to do, and I think we probably should test this approach at some point, because we have, like the study in Boston, I think we mentioned it, that we are paying a large amount of incentive to people, but we don't see as much.
They're paying what per month?
$220.
Per month?
For 8 weeks.
For 8 weeks.
Yeah. But we don't see as much compliance.
Do you have a sense which of these strategies works better? And is there, I guess there's not necessarily a linear relationship between the amount of money you provide?
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah.
So I have a sense that the data plan thing would be, we'll pay for your data plan, if you finish 80% of questions. So it seems the context in which we're thinking of using this seems to be.
Yeah, we'll come back to the issue of data plan as a quite significant point in a few slides. And maybe we could defer that there, because I agree with you that there's a lot of potential, particularly if there's some possibility of getting bulk data plans at lower costs from providers or what have you, from service providers, telcos. But there's also there's a number of other issues tangled up in there too, which are worth discussing. So I agree with you that for certain groups that can be a pretty big motivator as well. I would say that in our experience, I think the incentives that were gated or prorated by level of participation, I would say there's only one downside of those that I see. And unfortunately, it's a downside that has been experienced by Narges and Kurt, I think, which is the need to manually total up what package each person receives. And that's fairly laborious. It brings home a discussion that Mohammed had with myself and PhD student Rifat here, which concerned whether we could automate some of this mechanism that's otherwise pursued manually. It wasn't quite focused on the incentive issue, but it carries over to that. If we could automate some of this apportioning of, how adherent has someone been, and by extension, what is their package, that could make the whole thing much easier to deliver and much less burden for the study team. But in general, I found it seems those work pretty well as mechanisms to elicit participation. But Mohammed,
I think one other very important factor that is not discussed as much is how you want to pay them. If you want to pay them cash, I think as the amount goes higher, it's harder because like you might need their social security number or other numbers that might be necessary.
Quite right.
There are other concerns that if you pay them cash, how they might use it. That's why people opt to choose to pay in gift cards. Gift cards are not very favorable. It's very hard to come up with one gift card that everyone likes. That's why when you tell them that we pay you $200, but it's in gift cards, you're like, I don't need it.
Not interested.
Yeah, not interested. Some gift
What about
cards.
iTunes credit, I store credit.
It's very hard to come up with one type that everyone likes. Amazon has been the best because they have the wide variety of things that they can choose. But then Amazon in the States is very different than Amazon in Canada or Australia or elsewhere. But we have noticed like that sometimes we had like people. Well, I think in one of the studies, the study organizers decided to actually ask them what kind of gift card you want. That puts a lot of burden on them because then someone asks for Walmart, someone asks for what was the other one?
Cabela's.
All sorts of things. It's Target and Amazon. But you get all sorts of requests there.
My feeling has been that the incentives serve a dual purpose, and the first purpose is the more important. And it's almost so the biggest thing is you want people to participate, right? And getting kind of that activation energy you need to get them over the hump and in the study. And basically a lump sum payment of X or a gift card worth Y is pretty good for that. The second one, these kind of bit work incentives, basically, I've found to be less efficacious in the sense that, that the people who do well probably would have done well without the incentive. It's got as much to do with personality of the participants and how conscientious they are as it does the kind of financial remuneration. I think to get those people who have sloppy or laissez-faire personalities to be really on top of things, I think the incentives would have to be quite significant per interaction. It's pretty easy to say, oh well, if I miss this survey, I'm losing $1. You do that 20 times, it's always the same logic, and now you're up $20, which may have been enough to actually get you to do something. So there's a bit of a balance there. I would, as a rule of thumb, I've come to believe that it's better to front load it and get more better people in the study than to try and parcel it out into small bits over the course of it. But that's just totally anecdotal.
Yeah, I think there's interactions between those, such as for some of our studies which involved a higher burden, I think the only individuals that consider enrolling are individuals who say, okay, I'm willing to actually record that sort of information. And yeah, I mean, one of my concerns about having very high incentives up front is you may get people who are not very committed to participating. But I think there's a lot of learning that has to go on there for certainly. And it may be that some simple experimental design would allow us to better understand. I will say though, while this issue is worth sweating, and I think from my experience, and again, I think Kevin, myself, and Mohammed will each have rather different perspectives, and I think each of them brings quite a bit of insight and wisdom to bear from different experiences. But one of the things that I have found is just hugely different issues with different subpopulations. Yeah. Depending on who the population is, the issues are quite different. And this is one of the reasons it's hard to make very broad general statements, because an incentives for someone who's really in a difficult financial situation is very different from a student who's also got to pinch pennies some, but they're in a different phase of their life, versus someone who's juggling a career and a busy family and is quite well off, but financially that's not the foremost of their worries each night. And I think those are different circumstances, rather different. So I think, yeah, there is a lot to learn for different subpopulations on how to approach these issues. And this gets to this next slide, the impact of low SES, low socioeconomic status groups. We are still in a situation where when working with these groups, we do a lot of handing out of smartphones, or excuse me, should be careful. We have a lot of cases where we have the option of handing out smartphones. It doesn't always mean that most of the people in the study have smartphones given by us, but there's that need for the backstop of the smartphone to hand to someone. This issue was somewhat mentioned yesterday, that existing smartphones that they have in hand, that they may like it, it may be their personal smartphone with which they go around and pursue their day, but they're not suitable for installation, particularly when you have big plugins. This is one of the learning from one of the studies, which requires Firefox to be added, so we can monitor their exposure to pages with certain keywords in them. When they browse to a certain page mentioning certain keywords, it'll grab that information. That requires a big plug-in, and it's hard to fit on their phone. And there's some data storage needs. That was discussed some on the first day, and Jacinda mentioned some issues there with an earlier version of IEPI, et cetera. For low SES individuals considering data plans, now we're going to talk about the data plan issue and Wi-Fi and cell data plans. There's some trade-offs there, but with low SES individuals, there's still the potential for them to have low access to, and I don't mean low contact with, but actual log into and get on Wi-Fi networks. Now, Mohammed, you had made an interesting comment yesterday about, and this may have been something you and I directly after hours, about individuals, low SES individuals, not having issues with connectivity on Wi-Fi quite a bit, and making sure that they have data plans. Can you just explain that more?
The one that we are working with so far, we are not sure if we don't know how often they are on Wi-Fi and how often are. We don't have statistics. We have the data. We have to go through that and crunch data. But we have noticed that some that don't have access to Wi-Fi, it's just probably their lifestyle, that they are not connected to Wi-Fi as often. Right. So we don't get the data as fast as we expected. So the way that the app was configured before is that they had to, it was uploading via Wi-Fi by default, and they had to opt out. They had to uncheck it to say that yes, upload by data plan as well. So this turned out to be, a bit of a problem, especially for those who did not connect to Wi-Fi as often. So I think as of a couple of weeks ago, we had to change this to set. So now, by default, uploads with Wi-Fi or data plan, unless they check and say don't use data plan. Yeah. Now, how that affects people's cost of data plan because of uploading data, I don't think it's going to be major because of the size of data that we upload.
Is modest compared to.
But still, we have to be careful about that. Yeah, and
video watching.
Exactly. We have to be careful about that, and if we know that the participant we're dealing with has some concern with the data plan and so on, you probably have to just tell them that make sure you check this so you don't be charged for extra data plan costs or something.
Exactly. Okay, so that's an interesting observation there. That was the study running in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and Houston.
Correct.
Yeah. Now, some ethics boards in general are on the lookout for, and some are much more sensitive to this issue of what level of incentive constitutes coercion, particularly for low socioeconomic status individuals. At one point, are you almost forcing them socioeconomically to opt into the study because of the high level of incentive? And as I say, I mean, there's different attitudes towards how strictly incentives are kind of viewed as sort of a thank you versus as, being viewed as fee for service. I'm asking you to fill out these questionnaires, here's some money for that. And ethics boards in general, from my experience, tend to be much more comfortable with smaller amounts, and it's going to require some discussion with the ethics board what level of compensation is suitable, right? Now, with data plans can be attractive, but there's some challenges, some real challenges with them. One of them is you get individuals who are on different providers. So some are, TELUS, and some are Fido, and some are Verizon, and some are whatever else is out there. And now if you're saying, okay, we want to provide you a data plan, then one way to go about it is to say, okay, we're gonna, for Fido, we're gonna get you this data plan. For Verizon, this data plan. For Rogers, this data plan. For SaskTel, this data plan. And it's quite a bit of work to pick out the right data plan for all those providers. You can do it, but it's a fair bit of effort. The alternative is you just say, okay, we're going to have you go with Verizon as a carrier by virtue of entering the study. And that becomes problematic too, because then you get people, particularly for shorter studies, it's an unpalatable thing. You have to switch your carrier in order to have this. You may have a bundle with that carrier with your cable TV service, and now suddenly you've the old carrier and suddenly you've shifted it. And it starts to seem more intrusive into their lives and more trouble in terms of the footprint it leaves after the study is over. And so both of these are tricky. Now, that's not to say that we haven't dealt with them. We have, and maybe dealt with them more than we'd like to. It's very favorable if you can hand out, prepaid cards or something like. Well, it can be okay, but in general, I'd say there's a lot of tension around this. Mohammed, you've had a lot of experience with this on the ground.
Thing is that we actually got this data, we got these cards, and we tried to hand it out to people, but then people didn't want it. Some people wanted it, some people didn't want it because they were like, oh, I get mine paid through some other form. I have a family data plan, and I can't really use it, and it's pointless for me to get this. And they wanted a different form.
What about then sending you the phone bill each month saying, and we'll pay up to $50 a month off your phone bill or discount or whatever.
There are a lot of
$40 a month. They just send you the receipt.
Yeah, for example, I think the one of the ones that I can think of on top of my head is if it's a family data plan, then for example their dad pays for the whole family, and then there is no one bill that they can provide. That's why they really don't need it. And then for them, this incentive is basically just not worth it. So you have to either change it or they will not participate. That makes things very complicated. Yeah, and we had quite a few instances of that, especially with the study in Lawrence that are low SES group, but quite a few of them had this situation.
Yeah.
So still, cash is very, very more interesting for them because they can do a lot more. There are more complications, of course, on the other side, that how to distribute it and so on, and well, if there is an ethics consideration. But for participants, that's obviously the favorable option.
Yes, right. It's free of. It's free of a lot of encumbrances. One of the big issues about data plan is it's tied in with families, it's tied in with the voice plan, et cetera. As we'll see later in another slide, one nice thing about providing their cell phone coverage is you can reach them, reliably, and you don't have to worry they're going to be disconnected because of some issue, or they're going to switch plans to a different plan during the study, and now you can't reach them, and so on. That's a non-trivial issue, particularly for longer studies or studies which involve lower SES groups. Vish tells me at Harvard that they had they had a doozer of a time with a previous study, not doing with mHealth, but with computers and online browsing, where people were being evicted from homes and they couldn't get in touch with them, and it's a real issue for the low SES populations, that there are these special vulnerabilities, and if you can cover their communication needs, at least you have that line to them, which has significance. That being said, there's a perception issue here, which is also notable. Perception and reality issue. Ethica Health, for a given study, it can upload a fair bit of data. And you can buy a data plan for people that puts them well above that data. So it's well above the threshold needed for Ethica Health. But there may be a perception if they get an overage charge, if they're charged because their use goes over the amount approved for that month, that somehow it was Ethica Health that caused that. You're never sure just how much they're going to use elsewhere. And suffice it to say, in terms of rough data volumes, a teenager browsing a few videos or watching Hulu or some other video information can very quickly outstrip what Ethica Health will upload in a given month, actually. And so you want to keep it in perspective, but with overage charges, there's a natural reaction that, oh, it's this new thing that may have caused it. And you got to be careful about that. And I think very clearly delineate what you'll cover and what you won't.
So what is a rough average of data that would be uploaded in a month?
Mohammed, you actually had some very detailed, I have some numbers off the top of my head.
So if you're getting video and photos, or audio and photos?
It is every audio is 3 megabytes. And every photo is also 2 to 3 megabytes, depending on the quality of the photo.
So you said 230?
2 megabytes.
No, but you said for the month.
So for the month, I think I did once calculation that if it's 3 surveys, 3 image or audio per day,
okay,
for 30 days was I think overall was 800 megabytes in total, including the data, the sensor data is uploaded.
Including the sensor data, 800 megabytes.
Yeah. So that includes your GPS.
Yeah, the sensor data is very modest because it's compressed. So it's I think 200 megabytes for the whole month, assuming that you have quite a few.
200 megabytes for sensor data.
That would be very heavy.
Yeah.
So for very heavy use. I'm repeating this for the internet audience. Yeah.
So the big chunk of that 800 megabytes is the videos and the audio and images that are uploaded.
Yeah.
And it's fair to say that 3 audio or image per day is relatively the upper bound. Maybe not maximum, but relatively upper bound.
So that's 3 per day for a month.
For a month.
Okay.
3 per day per month is roughly 600 megabytes.
It's roughly 600 megabytes. Yeah.
So the total about 800 megabytes per month, as a very heavy. That's a high estimate.
That's
a high estimate.
Yeah. We calculated that, and then we thought it's a good estimate is to give them 2 gigabytes of data plan. The problem we had is that you deal with quite a few carriers, and each of them have their own data plan, and none of them you can't really find. How they work. They set their plan in a way that no one figures out how much they give away. So we had to literally search for Verizon, AT&T, and all these ones for a week to figure out how much it costs us for 2 gigabytes of data plan per month. And they don't answer you when you call them because they don't want to deal with these situations.
Yeah.
So we figured out that probably it's about $40, $50. Then we thought, maybe $50 per month of data plan is a reasonable amount. Then we got the cards. We tried to hand it out to people. Then some people said, I have mine paid elsewhere or in another form. I don't need it. So I think we had always Walmart card as well and Amazon. If they didn't need it, we would give them something else.
Right.
But we always told them that you have to be connected through data plan.
Yeah.
So.
I think 800 meg is what, 1 half-hour sitcom on Netflix about?
Even less than half an hour, yeah. Depending if you watch HD, probably it's 20 minutes of video.
20 minutes of video might be 800 megabytes.
Yeah.
And again, data plans might be a couple of gigabytes for the month, right? Yeah.
So have you had problems in getting people to comply to get a cell phone number? Saying you have to get a cell phone number?
All of them did have a phone already.
Okay, all of the people you've done have already had
Had a phone, because if they didn't have a phone, then we also had a problem that if they are using Android or iOS for the first time, there is a learning curve there as well. Now, all of them had phone, but one of them in particular had a very, very old phone that we had to just say, you know what, just throw away your phone, we will get you a new line. And then one of the study coordinators had to literally go with him to Metro PCS in the States and just sign him up for a phone. It needs a lot of...
Yeah, I had 4, 5, 6 participants that were like that.
Yeah.
Out of 20.
So,
Yeah.
so it's even worse.
Yeah.
That's why I was curious.
I mean, we'll come back to this issue of the type of data, but one advantage of having that data plan is then you can be getting data on a very regular basis from these participants in a way that doesn't depend on the vagaries of when they access Wi-Fi
That's what I was wondering.
you know, their particular situation. So for our population that Tina is working to monitor here with HIV, related to that little study there, you know, many of them individuals with very little means or homeless, although there are also some individuals of very different character. You know, a data plan is gold. I mean, it's great because it allows us to kind of stay in touch and allows the data to come in a way that for a homeless person just wouldn't be able to come from. It does have a high monthly cost, right? One of the things Kevin and I have been trying for, it's like the you know, it would be like the golden land. It would be manna from heaven if we could make it happen. Would be if a telco provider could kick in free data plans, basically as an in-kind contribution, take the tax write-off, and we get a huge incentive for people. And for them, it's probably, you know, dimes per month or something to support this. But thus far, our attempts to penetrate the corridors of power have been limited.
Does Canada have a monopoly telco provider?
We have an oligopoly.
An oligopoly, right?
Yeah.
So it may be easier in Australia where we only, you know, you can complain all you want about your telecommunications. It doesn't matter because there's only one company. You know, one company owns it.
Okay, natural monopoly. Yeah. Well, that would make it easier if you can get the right ear with the right person, right? Yeah, but actually, it makes it easier for this whole issue of provider-specific provision, right, Andrew? I mean, that sounds to me like it would ease so much of the work. So you're not dealing with this crazy quilt of different providers for different people.
I mean, as I say, there aren't a range of companies out there offering services, but behind, you know, they're all, you know, there's Optus and Virgin and so on, but they're all using
the underlying infrastructure.
That's owned by one company.
Got it. Okay.
So you think you have choice. You think you
right. Okay. So right.
Make two notes here.
Yeah.
One is with respect to this overage issue, particularly for people who are getting data plans for the first time or recently don't understand how big data is. You got to be careful to tell them, you know, that you've got 2 gigs of data, we're using 800. That means you've got about 1 episode of Seinfeld that you can download over the internet before you're going to get into overage, because those overage charges can be punitive. And the second thing is you can leverage public Wi-Fi, and it worked kind of okay in the one we did with Jacinta. No, it didn't. We ended up having to do it.
We tried to get people to use the library and other Wi-Fi, but it didn't allow for enough upstream bandwidth.
Right.
So people weren't able to upload in a significant amount of time, so we never got the data. So we actually had to get them to come to Station 20 West to plug in, sign into the secure to get it to upload. Was the only way that we could do it because it wasn't working at the library or anywhere else. And that's the only thing we could figure out why it wasn't working at the library, because there was some sort of restriction on upload. Yeah, something was bottlenecking it.
And unfortunately, the telcos have been thoroughly reprehensible in terms of trying to lessen the amount of public Wi-Fi available around. And I think this is going on a lot of the growth that they see as a threat to their business, to their charges that they can provide. So, yeah, probably isn't going to get a lot better.
The final corollary, though, is that if you do have plans, they often do come with, you can use our not public Wi-Fi's, a lot of the hotspots.
Quite right, quite right, that's a good point.
So getting the participant to sign in and sign up for those Rogers or Bell or whatever hotspots, so that it automatically will connect, is a way of kind of.
Nice point, yeah.
Every time
If
you go
they're
to
all
Ireland-
signed up to the same one.
Well, you'll have to do it for each one.
Yeah.
Differently, but
Yeah.
I know in Europe they even do it so that you can upload through other people's routers at home, basically.
Okay, just one comment that struck me as bearing note is we do quite a bit of work, and in fact, this is going to be a growing amount of work in inpatient populations beyond our classic focus and sort of more population level surveillance. So here, observing people in very controlled circumstances, or at least, I shouldn't say that. I mean, in some cases, controlled circumstances like clinics. That's something Amin is working with, where there's going to be initial engagement in clinics with caregiver, infant, dyads, and then it's going to migrate to the homes later. And these institutional surrounds or inpatient surrounds, behavioral patterns are unlikely to be representative of what's seen outside, what Kevin sometimes calls in the wild. But the data backhaul is readily ensured. So if they're accessing things in a clinic, you can have them use the clinic Wi-Fi and get the data streaming off. Phones are easily provided and retrieved. In fact, smartwatches as well. That's what Amin is going to be doing, making sure the smartwatches get onto the individuals, measure the electrodermal response, the stress responses via heart rate variable electrodermal response. There's ready access to participants for feedback, troubleshooting, incentives, hearing their concerns, so you can address barriers, getting them over that activation level in terms of barriers. Clinical helpers, however, as we'll talk about later, the people who are facilitating the study need to have some level of training with the device. I think I've and Amin here have both dealt with challenges where the person involved in the patient contact is not someone who understands the smartphone. And on the face of it, it may seem that, they're just carrying the smartphone to the person and providing and going through a script. But in fact, sometimes things throw them off from script. So, a lot of the time what they found, for example, is that there were connectivity issues. The person who was handing out the smartphone didn't realize the phone wasn't connected to the network because they didn't know the system well enough. And that was a barrier. So there needs to be local people who have at least a working knowledge of whatever type of phone is being provided. Sometimes clinic workers can resent or be begrudging about extra work. Amin has also encountered this, where nurses, nurses' station was an exchange point, and the nurses weren't always supportive of that, right? On the other hand, in this clinical situation, more complete instrumentation could be possible. You're not depending on the willingness of the person in their own home to take the time to put the smartwatch on the baby or what have you. And but on the other hand, in an inpatient context, there is a key ethics consideration as well. There's a power relationship issue between the clinician. Think about doctor, patient. You don't want the patient to have the impression that the doctor is saying, you have to enter this study or I'm not going to see you anymore. Or, my care for you is going to be favored if you enter the study. You need to steer clear of that. And that requires different protocols, and perhaps less straightforward protocols than you might sometimes like. It requires other people to be involved other than the clinician. The clinician doesn't mention it during the visit, but you simply indicate it with indirect means like signs being up or others who meet the patient in the waiting room or what have you. But the clinician is one step removed from that. In population surveillance, by contrast, you're sampling people in their homes, the day-to-day examples, but it can be harder to access participants, and there's a higher burden of self-management of the whole ecosystem by those participants. So, 4 cases of a smartwatch, the people in their homes have got to pair the watch with the phone in a successful way, and they have to strap it onto the baby, etc. And that imposes some extra complications. Okay, data backhaul. We spent some time on this before, so I don't think I'll go over this before. Wi-Fi versus Wi-Fi cellular plus cellular data networks. Wi-Fi is free, no risk of overage charges, no effort for data plans, none of this dealing with the crazy Delta providers. The cons are you're uncertain about when you're going to get the data. It may be actually take a couple days, particularly for low SES people, for them to come into contact with the Wi-Fi network. For others, Wi-Fi, they may be connected most of the day. Ethica right now, Mohammed is left right now, but Ethica right now can record as a stream. You've seen it, right? In the interface, you can record Wi-Fi contact. What it does not record right now, to the best of my knowledge, but Mohammed and I have spent a while talking about adding it, would be a stream associated with connection to Wi-Fi networks. So you could know from an individual from 1 week worth of activity how often they connect to a Wi-Fi network, for example. Not just have contact with it, not just it's measured, but they actually log into it and achieve internet access. If we knew that, we could probably better throttle which of these we use. So whether they need a cell data plan, or whether this is an individual where we're going to get data on a daily or bi-daily basis through Wi-Fi. And that's a point of addition for Ethica that my guess is that we'll be seeing in a not too distant future. What are the pros for cellular data networks? So you get timely delivery, right? Data plan can serve as an incentive. You can reach the participant. That was in another slide I have, but I didn't add it here. I should have. It's costly. It can be difficult to arrange, and adding to existing plans is often involved. So that's also an additional element. Can bundle with voice to easily reach participant. Okay, that should really have been in here. Okay, let's talk about phones. So you're planning your study. You got to plan how are they going to connect. You got to plan, okay, how are we going to deal with phones? Okay, participant-owned phones. There's a natural incentive for people to retain. People are familiar with the phone. They know how to get around on it. We talked about this before. I'm not going to beat a dead horse, but there sometimes with low SES individual space issues, screen size issues, constraints, smaller form size performance, and I'd included here battery performance. They may be dealing with a phone that's quite old and the battery life is poor. Now these days, Ethica's battery life is very favorable. It's actually quite a small footprint. But it does add some, particularly if they're not heavy cell phone users, heavy smartphone users now. It may add materially, and if they already are suffering from a battery life that leads the phone to die in the course of the day before they sleep, then we may have data truncated, right? Another thing is if they're owning the phone, it's up to them about when to switch, right? And that's something which exposes the study to risk, because they may switch to a phone which doesn't have Ethica on it, and now you've got to get them to download it again and enter their information so that they're enter their username and password so that, it will resume. To be clear, they don't have to go through the whole registration process again. No, they just enter that information. But that one step is requiring something active of them. And you may miss a week worth of data, maybe the most intense week, just because they happen to switch phones. So there is that risk. For participant-owned, well, again, they're calling the shots. They've got their telecommunications providers. Now you're dealing with them. You have to deal with them if you want to provide a data plan. Study-provided phones, you can select an effective model, effective in terms of size, form factor, the screen, dimension. You could buy a model where you have the buttons that Amin is illustrating, which need to have colors associated with them. Those can be lined up with a background image. So you have background image which mirrors the purpose of the buttons. You use the background image to kind of communicate the purpose of the buttons with color. So by selecting your model, you can standardize around that model. Tech support is very familiar with the model. Fewer variables there. You can choose the telecommunications provider. You're providing this phone. And you can ensure that it starts with adequate space. Now, they could download 100 cat videos in the first week and fill it up, but at least it starts with adequate space, and you can sidestep a lot of the most common issues with space or speed of the phone, etc. The cons is it may not be accepted by participants. It can be costly, and there are cases where those phones disappear. We have had several circumstances of phones disappearing in the course of studies. One of them traveled with a student back to Persia, I believe, and we didn't trace it. Another case, a participant in a psychiatry experiment made off with the phone, and we could observe very closely that person's location and circulation patterns in the city. They had an affinity for traveling on the ring road around Saskatoon, and we could trace their steps, but we elected not to pursue it with the police. In other cases, non-return of phone it has been in the form of the phone was damaged, or so it was said. There is a risk here that you may have to put down more money to provide a new phone, and it gets diverted or destroyed in a way that imposes costs for the study. So study-provided phones, participant-owned phones has some trade-offs, and often now we deal with these hybrid models. And I would highlight Kevin's really good points about hybrid models here, with getting people signed up for cell phone network for corresponding Wi-Fi networks for those. Yeah.
So I think the corollary to may not be accepted by participant under cons for the study-provided phones is we generally observe lower compliance. That is, so for example, sometimes where we've issued Android phones to participants who have iPhones because they don't have an iPhone yet, and about halfway through the study they decide that they'd rather just use their iPhone, and then the study phone ends up in the drawer, and we get 2 weeks worth of data. So.
Yeah.
So.
Good. Wi-Fi.
Definitely have the lower SES, if they don't have a phone and now they have one, or they had a flip phone and now they've got a smartphone, that generally is better. But when you've got people that have a phone they like and they say, no, you have to use this one, often that leads to reduced compliance.
Exactly. We were running one study in Lawrence, and maybe it was in Boston as well, 2 years ago. And this was again with low SES populations, and we had participants outright refuse our phones. We thought that they'd be a great little phone. Man, I would have liked it. Better than my current phone. And but they said, nah, we have an iPhone 5 or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm not going to take your little phone.
Little Android.
Yeah, little Android phone. And what can you say? there was the option, and we didn't have the budget to pay a lot more. We couldn't buy them, the highest end Android. And so the point is, it goes beyond stereotypes about people's moms. Sometimes people care very much. Now, I think Ethica's presence now on the iPhone is going to make a big difference here in terms of opt-in, because that's always been a real barrier. People say, I'm an iPhone person, and I'm not going to take your stinking Android phone, right? And now we don't have to offer them a stinking Android. We can offer them a stinking iPhone. But anyway, we can offer them a phone closer to their preferences, and that makes a big difference in terms of involvement. Yeah.
So you can infiltrate the cult now.
Well,
The cult of Apple.
Yeah, that's right.
You make it very difficult to infiltrate.
Okay, so any case, those are some comments on studies on anyone want to sort of add to that discussion before we move on to some additional topics, including moving on soon to discussion of the study operations side? No? Okay. Okay, so that's our next major topic, but before that, I wanted to talk about another matter of significance to many in the room, which is budgeting a study.